our panel, our members over here, and those of you who've come to the meeting, and those of you who are watching on the webcast. Our meeting today of the Planning Committee is having as its main issue London's industrial land and accommodation, and what is the demand for it, and can we manage that, and what are the threats to it, and what and how should we inform, what should inform government policy, London government policy, and also what other mechanisms could the Mayor use to help the situation. Now, before we get on to that agenda item, I just want us to go through the business. If you'll bear with me, guests, just take us through the business so that we can then really concentrate on this issue. And then I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves. So Teresa Pearce, Committee Clerk, is going to take us through the business.
Thank you, Chair. The first item is apologies for absence, and there are no apologies today. The second item is declarations of interest, and can I ask the committee to note the list of offices held by Assembly members as set out on the agenda, and can I ask members to declare any additional interests?
Are there any declarations?
No.
Can I ask members to confirm the minutes of the last meeting of the committee on the 28th of June 2017? Thank you. Can I ask members to note the ongoing and completed actions highlighted on agenda item 4?
Noted.
And can I ask members to note the action taken by the Chair under delegated authority as set out on the agenda?
Agreed.
And then the committee will now move to do items 7, 8 and 9 and then come back to the main agenda item, as the Chair said. So the next item is a proposal for a rapporteur review for fire prevention automatic water suppression systems in London. Can I ask the committee please to agree to recommend the Greater London Authority Oversight Committee to appoint Navin Shah as a rapporteur to investigate the effectiveness and economic viability of requiring automatic water suppression systems, sprinklers in all London buildings, and agree the scope and terms of reference for the proposed investigation into the effectiveness and economic viability of requiring automatic water suppression systems, sprinklers in all London buildings, as set out in paragraphs 4.4 to 4.6 of the report and Appendix 1 of the report.
Yes, I just want to say this will be undertaken by Navin Shah, and our understanding is that it's actually going to be about new build, about any building that has a planning application, so new build and large refurbishments. It's not on all buildings, but that's the exploration. But you have a point, Andrew Boff.
Yeah, I don't for a minute think this isn't a proper thing to be doing. I'm a little concerned about the timing and some of the remit. Is there not a concern here that, bearing in mind the reviews that are taking place at the moment into the Grenfell Tower disaster, that we might be reporting prior to important information coming out of those reviews? Also, I thought all new buildings had to have sprinklers anyway. But obviously, I must be wrong, because this rapporteurship is saying one of the points of the rapporteurship is to investigate whether or not all new buildings should have sprinkler systems. I'm just a little confused about the focus of this, and that it might be possibly more effective at another time. But I don't wish to detract from the importance of it.
Chair, in response, I'd briefly like to say that, first of all, given the focus, and quite rightly, that there is not only in London but nationally on enhanced fire safety, which is what we require, I think this is the right time to do it. No way this is about Grenfell Tower fire itself, or the paper will be actually looking into reviewing any of those aspects in Grenfell Tower. This is a kind of stand-alone but important, serious professional scrutiny that I believe we need to undertake. From my experience, this issue has been a number of times sort of kicked into long grass. We've got to grapple with this problem, because the automatic suppression system commonly known as sprinklers, is something which will add an additional means to have enhanced fire safety. The scrutiny actually involves both desktop research as well as taking evidence from expert witnesses, which will cover right from the fire authority to building research establishment and fire engineers institute and so on. The timing is right. We're looking at having the sort of work completed without much resources from GLA scrutiny team by around February, March. This will in no way detract. If anything, it will complement what is being done in relation to Grenfell Tower, and something, because piecemeal various authorities, for example, Croydon, Sheffield, etc., have now announced that they are going to retrofit sprinklers. I think it is time that we look at what needs to be done nationally in an informed manner. Wales already in 2016, since then they have made sprinklers or automatic suppression system as a mandatory requirement, which isn't the case here. So this is something which paper will look at, both viability as well as effectiveness of this fire suppression system.
Would you want to check? So
Yeah.
Wales has introduced exactly what you're talking about, which is for new build and for large-scale refurbishment.
Well, it's interesting because Wales has got their system applicable to new build as well as change of use applications, and that covers new houses and flats, care homes, rooms for residential purposes, which includes hotel, hospital, prisons, etc., and registered group homes and sheltered housing.
Okay.
So that gives you a kind of scope. But this will be, again, we'll be looking at that because I appreciate that retrofitting, albeit, like Coroner had recommended after Lacknell fire that
I don't want to drag this. I don't want to drag this out too long.
I don't want to take.
Yeah, well,
but it's important that
I don't want to debate the issue. It's more to set the specification. It's just that, as I said, if we could look at whether or not, because I thought after Lacknell, all new buildings did have to have sprinklers. Obviously, I'm wrong.
We recommended it. But
obviously, I'm wrong. And so, if part of this can set out the position as we are at the moment. But also, I wish you well with it. I'm just saying. I think it'd have done it 6 months later.
Andrew, can we just note what you've said? Note what you've said, and ensure that we get an interim report. And maybe one of the bits of the scope of paper is about looking at the economic viability, and I think that would be an angle that would be a good one perhaps to follow. So, on that basis, can we agree this? Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. And then could I please ask the committee to note the progress on the work programme at agenda item 8 and delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree the subject scope and terms of reference for the main agenda item for the committee's next meeting on the 14th of November.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And then if the committee could just note that the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 14th of November at 10 o'clock in this committee room.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
And then it's back to the chair and the main item.
All right. So, now we can get on with our item, agenda item 6, on industrial land in London and London's need for industrial accommodation. So, it would be very helpful if each person on our panel, there's a rather large panel today, would actually just say who they are, and for the webcast, just give 2 or 3 lines on their involvement in this. Jules.
Jules Pint, Deputy Mayor for Planning, bringing forward the draft London plan, the new draft London plan published at the end of November of about 10 or so chapters. One will be on the capital's economy, and a number of essential planks to that chapter will be about the importance of industrial land to London.
Excellent.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerard Burgess. I'm a senior planner in the Greater London Authority's London Plan team. So my role has been leading the two pieces of research into the supply of industrial land in London and latterly the demands for industrial land in London over the next 25 to 26 years. And then I'm also involved in drafting new policy for the Mayor's new London Plan and advising Jules, Deputy Mayor.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Dakers, Chief Executive of West London Business and the Park Royal Business Group. We provide a voice for business across North West London. Park Royal, of course, the UK's largest industrial estate, and as such, with the decline in availability of industrial land across the city, it's putting more of a concentrated demand on Park Royal, which is, of course, considerable concern to it and interest to our members.
Afternoon, I'm Mark Jenkinson from Siemens, the City Director for London. I'm based in our Crystal building, the Royal Docks, which is an enterprise zone, I think London's only, so I guess that's one perspective. And obviously we're a big manufacturer. We've been in London since 1850, had a factory in Woolwich, Charlton in 1858. So again, we've been involved in manufacturing for a very long time, but we're now actually leading the review of the government on the industrialisation for digitalisation. So I guess obviously the new Industry 4.0 or the fourth industrial revolution. So we're a big focus on that and how we can actually, rather than the third industrial revolution, which passes by, how we can actually grab hold of the fourth.
I'm Mark Brearley. I'm a Professor of Urbanism at the CAS, London Metropolitan University, and I've been involved for about 20 years in questions around London's industry and its accommodation. I'm also the proprietor of a manufacturing business just off the Bullkent Road.
Good afternoon, my name is Newen Piazzi. I'm the Partnership Development Director at SEGRO. We are London's largest industrial developer. We're an owner and manager of industrial space. We own about 12.5 million square feet across the capital, across 55 estates, which is home to around 420 customers. We build anything from 500 square feet in London up to about 150,000 square feet. So we provide a kind of thriving commercial accommodation for a range of SMEs and corporates. We are also the Mayor of London's development partner in East London, where we are planning to deliver 1.4 million square feet of modern industrial space across Newham, Barking, Dagenham and Havering.
Good afternoon, my name's Harry Reid. I'm an asset manager at Capital Industrial. Capital Industrial are a owner and manager of light industrial space, all located within inside the M25 across about in excess of 2 million square feet of space with in excess of 800 tenants.
Thank you very much. We are going to also introduce two other people who are in the audience at the moment, just for particular parts of the discussion. Just want to say to everyone, we've got an absolutely cracking panel here. And I just want to say, we cannot, very rarely will we be able to ask all of you for your perspective on each question. So we're going to target to a certain extent. But if you feel, when it's your turn to speak, that you might have said something about a previous question, then do chip in. But you understand we've got to do something about the time management, because we wanted these perspectives, and we've got a huge range here. But we can't, we've got to manage the time as well. So if I kick off by asking, perhaps starting with Harry, but it'd be good to ask Gerard too, and Jules, but can you just give me some idea of the sort of the different trends in demand that are emerging, have emerged?
Yeah, certainly. I think we're seeing the level of demand sort of remaining at a fairly constant level in London, and in some cases increasing in certain areas. We're seeing rent levels also increasing because of this demand, and this is due to the lack of, the industrial stock in London being released at a fairly high rate. We're seeing lots of manufacturing businesses who have had the ability to move out of their current locations due to not having a requirement to actually work necessarily in central London, and have done so already. And also businesses, you know, certainly with an international outlook, so they're not tied to London. They've actually certainly been moving, you know, it's very difficult because you know, because there's been such a huge release of this stock in London. It's difficult to further justify in the release of any more. So especially with this increase in, you know, sustained level of demand.
So you're actually saying it's a sustained level of demand. Would anyone else have a different view of that?
Yes, Chair. We probably, I think our companies kind of complement each other in terms of our target audience. I mean, we're seeing a huge kind of structural change in the demand for industrial space, which is driven by technology and the impact that's having on retail demand. So, in particular, in the growth of online buying and e-commerce. So the market today in the UK, 20% of all retail is online, and that's a £60 billion market. And that is, has a huge difference in how people are receiving their goods. And most of those goods we order online or mobile devices, and they are delivered either to your place of work, to your home, or to whatever point you choose. And it's that flexibility and that demand that we are seeing growth you know, you're seeing customers like Amazon and ASOS and those sectors with a huge demand to meet the needs of their customers, and therefore they are looking for prime locations in London, not outside of London, because the demand is all around timing. So that's where we're seeing a huge demand. And that sector is also creating a new supply chain, which is reverse logistics. So it's not just the movement of goods to a consumer or to a business, but sometimes those goods aren't needed and they have to be returned as well. So we don't see that, we see the growth that continuing as more people buy online, and the next generation of Londoners will be doing that also.
Does anyone else want to come in on this? Jules?
Yes, I mean, I think there's probably a healthy requirement for all from many sectors, not necessarily sort of heavy, dirty industry to be located in the centre of London, but certainly from new emerging industries, you know, small-scale food manufacturing, light industrial. So sort of things that could occupy those small, formerly light industrial, so that might be light manufacturing, but are now into sort of more sort of food, fashion, furniture on a small scale. So there's after, and then slightly, well, then larger. There, as Neil says, there's a strong demand on logistics, and particularly with e-tailing, e-commerce as well. So there's pressure there. I think, though, that as the conversation develops, what we probably will tease out, though, is that there's an imbalance across London where that demand is. Certainly, there's a lot of pressure on West London more than there is in East London, if one looks at vacancy rates, for example.
Yes, no, we are going to drill down as time goes on. But if no one's got anything more, I mean, we are going to drill down. Oh, Mark, you want to come in?
Well, I think it echoes. I'll have a go at 4 reasons for changing demand. Biggest is London is growing. The overwhelming majority of London's industrial economy, just to remind you, about 500,000 people employed in it, is focused on serving London. It's a market-linked, just-in-time world. More people need more pints of milk, more buildings, more school dinners, more hospital bed sheets and all that. Number 2, London's remarkable concentration of skilled and entrepreneurial people, and the fact that metropolitan lifestyles have returned to popularity. People create and grow industrial businesses here. 3, increasing prosperity, fueling growth in hospitality, cultural consumption, small building works, deluxe homewares and foods, everything niche and differentiated, which all generates industrial activity that needs to be close at hand fabricators, launderers, caterers, bakers, event equipment providers, set and prop makers, builders, merchants, contractors, art producers, tailors, all booming. Finally, 4 mentioned dramatic changes in the distribution economy, in-house and contract carriers with ever greater need for a network of last few mile depots.
Okay, that's given us a lot of food for thought. I think perhaps it would be a good idea if we went on to our second question, unless anyone else wants to come in. Would you come in?
Just wanted to echo what people are saying that has been shown in our quantification of demands in the recently published Industrial Demand Study, which for the first time since doing these studies we are now projecting a positive net demand for industrial land in London for all of the reasons which we've heard from correspondents along the panel. And the other key stat is that vacancy rates have been declining significantly. So back in 2001, we were looking at a vacancy rate in London of around 16%. That dropped to 12% in 2010, 11% in 2015. So there is still some way to go to reduce that level of vacancy in some parts of London, and particularly in parts of the Thames Gateway. But we are seeing that in response to demand, that vacancy rates in many boroughs in London are less than 5%, so showing healthy demand for those types of functions.
Yes, well, I think there might be implications from that. This morning we were talking about Park Royal in the Assembly plenary, and there the vacancy rate's at 2% in terms of land, which is dangerously low, I think. But come in, Harry.
I just wanted to say that, reinforce that point. I mean, that is exactly right. I mean, definitely vacancy rates are sub 5% on most of our estates. We're just seeing incredibly high demand, and I think the closer into central London, the higher the demand. And I think it is these sort of last mile businesses, or people just have a requirement that need, where they need to be close to the city, to service, say, some of the offices or whatever their business is. It is important that they need to be that central. So the closer to the centre, the higher the demand for these units.
Somebody else come in.
If I might add to sort of Mark's commentary on the sort of wider context of population growth, I think the additional challenge that we've of course experienced in Park Royal is the development of a new infrastructure, particularly HS2, which we of course welcome. Very, very necessary that investment flows. But on the eastern edge of Park Royal, we've seen some 75 businesses, from micros through to very large enterprises, that will be displaced over the next 6 months, and of course have spent the past 12 months trying to find new locations to relocate into. And of course that contributes to why we have the 2% sort of vacancy rate, a very low vacancy rate that you mentioned.
Yes. I think Park Royal is a very interesting case study, in fact, because those relocated industries, we're told, are going to be relocated into the strategic industrial location, the Park Royal, which is actually the engine of the UK industrial economy in some way. But I'm concerned really about whether Park Royal is going to be able to accommodate this. It's got huge waiting lists. We know there are pressures. Well, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but we know there are pressures all over London now for space, and it's really whether we can really not just protect Park Royal, but strengthen it. But we can move on to that shortly. Shall we go on to our second question, because it does overlap?
I think we may have already answered it, Chair, but I'll ask it anyway to Jules and Gerard. What has been the impact of the policy of managed release of industrial land as set out in the current London plan, please?
Well, I think the figures that you just heard about vacancy rate shows that we're kind of on the cusp there of a real problem, because some of them getting down to very low single figures vacancy rates. And that has come about through the release of industrial land in recent years, over the last decade or so, that's way outstripped what the benchmark was in the so take the last London plan in 2011. I think the benchmark release was 37 hectares per annum, and it's been about 7 times that rate in central London and about 3 times that rate overall in the capital. The demand study indicates that really this plan, we should be looking to lower that dramatically from 37 to 9 hectares a year as a benchmark of expected release. But actually, when you look at that trend, and when you look at the fact that there are several hundred hectares already in the pipeline for release that have been permissioned, and then there's even probably sort of 700-800 further hectares that people have earmarked for release. That suggests that we should be discouraging any further active release of industrial land. And I don't want to sort of expand too much on that in answer this question in case we want to tease this out later on. But what we're not going to suggest in response to that is that the existing situation is preserved in aspect. Actually, we've got to do something more creative than that. We've got to look at intensifying the use of the land that we do have now, whether it's strategic industrial land, or whether it's LSIS, or whether it's just happens to be locally used as that and undesignated. We need to, rather than just waive it or accepting the loss, let alone encouraging it, we need to be ensuring that we just sweat that asset and allow other people to sweat it more to kind of address some of the needs that have been outlined. And just to give you one example, and I know that there's someone on this panel who can speak very well to this, and that's starting in this country to do more double decking of logistics. We tend to do single-storey sheds all over this country, and yet that's quite where it's common in other countries, not just China, but in Europe, to exploit the footprint of a site much better than we do in this country. So we'd be that as just one example is the kind of thing that we'd be wanting to see happen, to expand the floor space of industrial land.
We're going to explore that later too, aren't we?
Gerard, perhaps you'd like to answer the second part, which again has been partly answered. What are the main factors driving the loss of industrial land? How far has the Mayor and the boroughs particularly, maybe you could address the boroughs point particularly, be able to address these factors? And my final point, and I'll shut up, is in terms of PD rights being extended by the government at the moment, last year and at the end of this month, what can we do about that?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, I think the factors that are driving the loss of industrial land are numerous, and I'll pick up on a few of them here, and I'm sure other members of the panel will have others. But I think one of the key drivers has been the fact that there are higher value uses, such as residential, but also offices and retail, which has led landowners and developers to seek changes of use on specific parcels of land to maximise the value of those areas of land. And I think what the annual monitoring reports have shown is that historically a large proportion of those sites have been the smaller unprotected ones, so the ones outside of designated strategic industrial locations and locally significant sites, small sites less than 1 hectare, 0.1 of a hectare, where individually they don't look like a huge amount of loss, but cumulatively, when you add up all those losses, we've seen the benchmarks exceeded in almost every borough. I think there's only 1 or 2 boroughs where it wasn't exceeded. You've also got issues around the proximity of new residential development to industrial. As competition for land increases, we're seeing industry and residential coming into much closer proximity with each other. And I think in some cases this may be leading to the impact or curtailment of some of the industrial occupiers, recognising that many industrial businesses need 24 hours, 7-day-a-week access. And some cases it may be that inadequate mitigation has been put in place, or the design has not enabled those industrial occupiers to continue. whilst providing a good environment for residents. It may also be that the new residential development in proximity to industry is pushing up the hope value of those industrial sites. So again, that may lead landowners and developers to consider that actually this land may be in a higher value in that competing use, and then that might put some pressure on the change of use. But we've also seen pressures from other areas, and I think the trends toward out-of-centre retail warehouses. I mean, historically, we lost a lot of industrial land to retail warehouse uses because the operation of the sequential test, I think in the National Planning Policy Framework, led a lot of these big format retail stores to couldn't find the sites within town centres, which is where we were trying to direct that kind of development. So where did they look? They often looked to sites which were on the strategic road network, and often those were the ones which were industrial sites. So some of those were vulnerable to changes of use, and I think we've seen quite a few of our industrial areas impacted in that way. I think recently we've also seen a phenomenon of places of worship. So faith groups looking for accommodation to accommodate place of worship. Sometimes not being able to find those within town centres. And so they've looked for sort of larger warehouses in some cases in industrial areas to accommodate their congregation. So I think that has been a factor as well. And we've heard from Jules about the implementation of policy and how the studies have shown that the implementation has not led to the containment within the benchmarks, and we've actually exceeded the benchmarks in each case. And then finally, I think your point was on the impact of permitted development rights. And I think the one that's been sort of mostly on the radar has been offices to residential permitted development rights, which has been enforced since 2013. And we have found that there have been occupiers looking for prior approvals for offices in industrial locations, because offices are found within some industrial locations, not on the scale obviously in town centres and CAS, but there has been some pressure for change of use within industrial areas. And we've also had in place since 2015 permitted development rights for B8 warehousing and distribution floor space to residential. But our monitoring suggests that in this particular case the impact has been relatively low. So our monitoring on B8 warehousing to residential suggests around 12,500 square metres of warehousing floor space has got prior approval, but only 2,000 of that has actually been implemented. So it's quite interesting that there's a lot of some applications that have come in, but only a few implemented. But the 12,500 is less than 0.1% of the total warehousing stock. So it seems at the moment to be relatively low, that impact. But we will want to have a look at that a little bit more closely, particularly if it's going to impact on the strategic industrial locations. But it's for warehousing less than 500 square metres. So there is a threshold on that. And then, as we've reported, government are bringing in permitted development rights for light industrial to residential. That will come into force on the 1st of October. And we're aware of 10, I think possibly 11 boroughs have already taken action to bring forward what are called the Article 4 directions, which would remove those permitted development rights for parts of their boroughs. So a third of boroughs already taking action, and we've been urging other boroughs to follow suit.
I was going to say, as Jules written to the boroughs, but not all the boroughs have teams as strong as ours. Are they all aware of this is happening?
Well, they have been written to, and also we're committing to encourage, work with them, help them along.
That's right. And we presented to the Association of London Borough Planning Officers the results of the demand study and highlighted the fact that this was coming into force in October. So we've been doing what we can to raise it to boroughs' attention.
Thank you.
Tom, you want to come?
Just a point of information on the we were discussing this earlier at the plenary actually, on the light industrial permitted development. Does that apply in strategic industrial locations as well?
So there is a clause within the statutory instrument that says that a borough, when receiving its what's like a prior approval application, could reject that application if it thinks there could be a detrimental impact on the wider industrial area or a wider concentration of industrial uses. Now, I think in London, we would interpret that to mean all the strategic industrial locations and all the locally significant industrial sites.
That's interesting because the chair was asking the chair of the chief executive of the OPDC earlier about whether or not they might suddenly find industrial space being lost because of this, but what you're saying suggests that the OPDC could reject it on the grounds that it would have an impact on the wider area.
I think there could be evidence that would show that they could reject it on that line, which is in the instrument. Yeah.
However, I would just want to say this, Tom, because I've looked at this. Tom, I just want to say, and I've also been informed by Gerard, but this absolutely amazing study that the Mayor has commissioned, the evidence for the loss for demand. It's a demand study for industrial land, and that points out 36% of London's land is what's called non-designated, and that's what the permitted development rights will most attack. And now these are high streets. You know, these are town centres. This is where, you know, this scattered stuff is, behind the high streets. And it's from bakers to makers to mechanics. It's all sorts of things. And of course, Park Royal also, or Old Oak, is not, you know, the Old Oak part and not the Park Royal part has these industries in it. So that's why I was asking that question. It won't, because I was wondering, it will actually affect other parts of the OPDC, if not the SIL. I'm right there, aren't I, Gerard?
That's right, although I think the majority of the OPDC area for Park Royal is within SIL, but looking London-wide, yes, exactly right. It's those smaller sites, the back of High Street, the railway arches, the site at the end of the street, which is in a light industrial use, could be vulnerable to that change.
Yeah. And the Mayor has promised to bring this up with Alok Sharma and Greg Hands, because London really, if you look at the evidence that his own demand study shows, then really we should be exempt. London should be exempt from that. It just doesn't work for London's economy. It'd be very damaging. And I don't know yet if the Mayor has followed that up. Do you know, Jules?
Sorry, in what way followed up?
Ask for London, discussed whether in the light of the evidence base now, this new evidence, whether London could be exempt from this, the introduction of PD rights.
I know we have been raising it, but I'm not sure whether it's as simple as requiring the exemption. I mean, because we would be very unlikely to get it. I remember pushing previously for an exemption for London for the office to Resi PD right. I'm hopeful that it'll go the same way in a way as the office to Resi, in as much as that seems to be tapering off a little now, because I think that hopefully those who might be tempted to go that route realise actually you can get a much better result through a plan-led approach to an area and also a proper application to a site. You can get far greater density, you could retain the floor space of the employment floor space and intensify and get residential, and actually we could start creating not in SIL but in non-designated areas, actually a more kind of finer grain mixed communities, as there are in a number of formerly and predominantly industrial areas. Whereas at the moment I think there are too many industrial areas that are run down and are in need of improvement, but they should be done in a plan-led way that maximises, optimises what they can deliver, rather than someone flipping the kind of shell of a building into something that's very unsatisfactory, both for the residential occupants that end up in there, and also, as Gerard said, it being very inconvenient for the ongoing industrial operations that start receiving complaints about their operations.
I think the danger is, though, that even if it's not actually converted, or in fact it can be redeveloped, even if that doesn't happen, it's hope value, and therefore the rents go up. And
Yeah.
It adds to the difficulties for, I think,
Again, an argument for it being a plan-led way for an area rather than ad hoc applications.
absolutely. Mark, really?
I just thought it would be useful to add to the discussion about the effects of permitted development changes, as they have tended to undermine the sustainability of some industrial areas. There is also, to a lesser extent but significant, the process of permissions being given on appeal against the wishes of local authorities, and there is also, thirdly, a pattern of local planning authorities giving permissions in violation of their own policies that seek to protect industrial. All three of those together, in some cases, is what's causing not just quantum loss, but undermining the sustainability of an industrial area, because you get bits and pieces of residential popping up and making it very awkward for everything to work happily together anymore. But it's not just permitted development that's causing these problems.
Navin, do you want to?
My questions are about the new emerging and evolving industrial sectors. First broad question is about what are we seeing in terms of those new evolving and emerging industrial sectors? What are they, and are their needs different from what, so to speak, traditional manufacturing and warehousing uses? Can you start with Mark Jenkins, or Mark, if you want to come in? 2 marks.
Okay. Well, what's growing strongest? Here's 14. Builders merchants, self-storage, public transport depots and garages, catering, including the new phenomenon of dark kitchens, courier depots and single-use supply chain depots, just-in-time mass-market food production, industrial bakeries, soft drink production, higher-end food and drink production, art and artisan production, garment and accessory making. It's made a rather remarkable reappearance. Printing, culture-related production and logistics, laundries, bespoke furniture, joinery, steel fabrication and building fit-out, waste handling and recyclate capture. The headline is very diverse, most of it not completely new sectors at all. They're all just evolving and growing with London. And they are all at the small and medium scale. Even the big SEGRO style end of it is not properly big from a national perspective. It's all very London.
What about their needs? Are they any different from those traditionals, what you might consider? in terms
Not
of
dramatically, no.
Mm-hmm. Mark, do you want to?
Well, I guess there's an example just nearby where there's a kind of a startup called Sustainable Ventures, and probably some people here have probably been down there. And I guess one of their issues is storage. You know, they're kind of growing. It's just kind of a cheap space, but they're an e-car club, and their issue was where to store the batteries. So I guess it's, you know, where do they move next, and can they stay with their local supplier base and their supply chain, or do they have to move a bit further beyond? So I guess that's one issue for them when they start to grow. Where do they go next? But I think, you know, and I guess to answer one of the previous questions, I guess it's also probably important to understand what's happening in other cities around the world. I think Jules referred to it, but you know, if you look at some of our competitors around the world, you know, you look at Paris, 7% of their Paris is their output is from manufacturing. Shanghai is obviously up in about 44%. Only New York is similar to London. So again, you know, where our competitive cities having a big focus on manufacturing, and I guess we're at risk of again missing the boat if we don't actually embrace this and sort out the issues that we're here today to talk about. But I guess the new markets, we're a big focus on obviously on software, whether it's gaming, whether it's sensors, whether it's this new thing about driverless vehicles. Obviously this is going to be something that is going to hit us, and whether we actually manufacture these cars in Dagenham or in Aberdeen or wherever, I think more and more, I think the key thing is that we're trying to manufacture in this future factories locally, where people actually need the goods. So you're not transporting these goods from Aberdeen to London, you're actually transporting the goods locally. So also AI and robotics is obviously something that's we're seeing now more and more around the world. There's actually a good report by the UK RAS network, robotics and autonomous systems, called Manufacturing Robotics. Again, they're looking at the implications of the fourth industrial revolution and how that actually impacts on cities and how you should be designing cities to meet it. And then obviously things like additive manufacturing. So again, I think you mentioned a bit earlier, but we have one example where currently you're going to buy online, you need a replacement for Andrew's bike. At the moment you buy it on Amazon or wherever, and it's shipped, you pay £2.50 for it, and it's shipped from China, and it costs £7.50 to ship. Whereas you could actually, maybe you could 3D print it locally. Maybe in the future you can 3D print it on your desk. But again, you have it locally, so therefore you're reducing the emissions. And also obviously 3D printing is quite a good thing because you're minimising waste, because you're not actually producing from a batch and throwing product away. You're actually just using the product that you need for the actual devices. So I think, I guess it's, the question is obviously people need space and support, and we need to kind of redesign the city in a way that supports these people. But effectively it's, I think we need to act quickly.
When you mention redesign, what are we talking about in terms of any specific needs which are very different and distinctive as compared to your normal warehousing or industrial uses? Are we talking about, for example, digital connectivity, the whole IT aspects, any other infrastructure which needs to go in to accommodate those uses?
Well, definitely. I think digital connectivity is almost a given. Maybe I shouldn't say where, but there's one area which where we're based in the Royal Docks, and if you go to the north of the dock, it's got super duper broadband speed. If you go to the south of the dock, they have no broadband connection, or very limited. In fact, some offices actually have a wireless route to the side of the dock, and if some large object goes past, maybe a plane or a ship, their wireless connection drops out. So again, obviously digital connectivity is key, and when you've got people moving in, whether it's residents or industrial tenants, the first question they ask the developer is, what's the broadband speed? So certainly these people who are going to be looking at the fourth industrial revolution need, it's a given that they need really good broadband.
Neil, you want to?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on both Mark and Mark. I mean, I think Mark makes a really valuable. We've got to accept that we're talking about new emerging markets, but actually the existing demand. Food and drink is a prime example that as the population grows, things like clothing, we will just eat more, drink more, and more people wear more, and that has to be serviced. And I think coupled with that, the Mayor is looking to move to a 24-hour city, and therefore those demands will have to be met. Perhaps a 24-hour cycle rather than, So there's that existing. And then pick up on Mark's view around the technology. We are talking to our customers about, the kind of buildings they want for the future, and the kind of technology that we see being adopted. Robotics is one that's often spoken about, similar to autonomous vehicles. And that will happen. That I don't think that necessarily change where the buildings are sited. It will change some of the issues around utilities, broadband in particular, and power. But what the point that Mark makes really well is we can't miss that cycle. So who manufactures the robots? who services them, who designs the software, who maintains them, and you know, that's where you need, you know, the talent in London to do that, and that's the bit on the fourth generation that we've got to get our heads around, because we don't want that to bypass us and let our competitors in France or Germany coming over to service our robots in our industrial warehouses. In terms of the building specifics, we are seeing huge developments in sustainability. We have the only, I think, well, the first BREEAM outstanding building in London we built for Rolls-Royce, and we've built a carbon neutral building up in Enfield. So the idea of contributing to that, that sustainability is important. But it's about future-proofing the building, and that's about flexibility. So we don't design a building for a manufacturer or for an urban logistics company or for someone else's food. We design a building that can be adapted to any of those needs, and that's really key if you want to, create a building that meets the needs of all of our customers, and that is a physical requirement as well as a policy requirement. So if we need to put extra roller shutter doors in, if we need to extend the offices because there's an R&D need, if we need to agree on more car parking, in the building, then there are some of the policy, issues that we kind of face at a very local level. But actually, future-proofing the building is key here to make sure it's adaptable to because we won't know who the customer is in 10 years' time, or 20 years' time.
Well, that was my next question, actually. Now, given what's been stated, what policy changes that are required to enable those changes for the new and emerging industrial sector? Harry, you might...
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about the tenants that we have. I think Mark actually very well summed them up quite nicely. It is a lot of our tenants in the smaller industrial space are actually very traditional industrial users, and they're just kind of evolving their businesses. And in terms of the kind of space that they need, it's things like eaves height are actually incredibly important to these guys. If you've got a small 1,000-foot warehouse and you can put a mezzanine in it, it immediately makes that a much more viable prospect for that tenant, because they have perceived cheaper storage space or cheap space on the at a mezzanine level. And same goes for larger units as well. Connectivity and internet and things like that, that's obviously a consideration, but I mean it's becoming much more available in London anyway, and it's not too difficult to be able to put lines in or anything like that. But also it's very important to have good loading space, and be able to get articulated lorries onto sites to load and unload, and make sure that they can get their product onto these big lorries, or whatever they're doing. It's very, very important to these tenants to have that ability.
Andrew wants to come in.
If I may. So perhaps to pick up on both your questions, I'd recommend to the committee a piece of work recently completed for the OPDC, looking at the intensification of Park Royal, which is feeding into their new local plan for the area. And that, I suppose, broadly across the board, with a proactive approach by OPDC in terms of encouraging the established sectors in Park Royal, saw growth in the years ahead. The one area that was perhaps questioned in terms of its growth potential was the motor trade industry. And I have to say that's an area where, as West London Business, we would speculate that if OPDC were proactive, actually as automated vehicles come on stream, as long as we upskill the Park Royal workforce, there could be a new role for Park Royal and those professionals to play in that sector. I suppose alongside that, the research highlights the low carbon sector as offering some potential in Park Royal, and we can see perhaps the seeds of that in a number of businesses that have chosen to locate in Park Royal or close by in recent times, although, as I think was referred to in the case of Sustainable Bridges, a sort of incubator for low carbon businesses located close to here. One of the challenges for those start-up spaces and businesses is now, of course, the cost per square foot of accessing space in Park Royal, despite its attractiveness. And so I suppose to come on to the question of needs and what has attracted businesses to Park Royal over the years and indeed today. Of course, talent is incredibly important, and many of the businesses, whilst some might argue in terms of, I suppose, more optimal use of land, you might think could relocate outside the M25, etc. The reality is they've developed a very skilled workforce to drive their operations, and therefore they don't want to relocate. They often also, of course, have very close by customer bases, particularly in the case of food manufacturing. Heathrow is, of course, critical as a component of strength of Park Royal and the global gateway to markets it provides. And I think increasingly we may see that the universities that are investing just to the south of Park Royal, so of course Imperial College London, now in very close proximity, and also the Royal College of Art about to open a significant new site at White City, may find that there are new complementarities in their location close to Park Royal. So, for example, start-up businesses that have come out of Imperial that might have chosen until recently to locate into sustainable bridges around the corner from City Hall may decide that actually running their early-stage production lines close to a research lab at White City has its merits. The final point I'll make there is that where, of course, there are significant weaknesses at Park Royal that present real constraints to intensification, are broadband connectivity, which sadly, whilst it may be improving in other parts of London on other industrial estates, Park Royal is still a not spot for broadband, and it's taking a painfully long time to see decent broadband connectivity come into place, and also transport. Is a real challenge. Congestion on Park Royal sees the estate sort of grind to a halt at the beginning and end of the day without growth.
Jules, in the light of what the guests have mentioned in terms of what the sector is sort of, or who they're represented by, as well as what the needs are, I think two questions come to my mind. One is, are the current London plan policies relevant? How much do they cater for that? And where do you reckon your emphasis would be to support and enhance this new and emerging sector?
Well, as I said, I think the current plan and its implementation has unfortunately resulted in a degree of over de-designation and has seen of designated land, SIL and Alsace, and also for the reasons that we've discussed, non-designated land has come under huge pressure. So certainly in the new plan we'll be wanting to, as I say, my starting position here today was that we want to see no net loss going forward. We would want to see boroughs either provide more through intensification or retain what they have, or if probably in a limited number of boroughs there might be limited release, but no more. And we'll be passing the boroughs accordingly to designate the ones that we would expect to behave in that way.
One of the questions I have here also refers to the locations of such uses, either in town centres or on high streets. Which again is important because the whole range of this new sector, which generally cover SMEs, which is the large number of SMEs we have right across London. So again, protecting those sites near town centres or high streets is critical, and will this be something you'd be addressing in your new
yes,
policies?
Absolutely it would be. If I brought my glasses today, I would actually read policy, so I'm going to turn to Gerard. It's very small print.
Sure, yeah. So I think Yes, we recognise that town centres are home to a diverse range of commercial uses and community uses, of which these kind of small-scale, tend to be lighter industrial uses are a key part of the high street. Often they tend to occupy the slightly more lower cost market space, which tends to be the back of the high street, or it could be railway arches, or it could be in kind of secondary or fringe locations away from the primary shopping area to take advantage of the what tends to be lower cost space. So I think this kind of issue of where we can, ensuring we're not losing that lower cost space and business space overall is one of the things we want to look at, and particularly in relation to town centres, but in other parts as well.
And that's in addition to specifically requiring affordable space
Indeed.
as well. So
Indeed.
making a distinction between the naturally low cost and the deliberately created affordable.
I would say that would be applicable for the whole of the sector, because affordability, when you look at either creative industries or arts and so on, is a big issue, and to be able to sustain that as well, which is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, for certain clusters there'll be a deliberate push, and you've named one of them, sort of arts and cultural and creative industries. There'll be a deliberate specific policies about promoting that, and you've probably seen some things about the the cultural zones and things.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Chair. I'm done.
Can I just ask, I just want to just add one point about, what kind of city do we want to kind of, live in, and it's interesting, listen to.
Just speak up a bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. It's really about the kind of city we want to live in, and when I'm listening to colleagues on this side, certainly about that there is a local requirement. Some fantastic kind of owner-occupier businesses. The kind of companies that occupy behind the high street are providing valuable service to that local community, whether it's jobs or goods and services. And then, alongside that strategic level of how do we keep London's supply chain moving. If we look at somewhere like central London, where, we've seen high losses of industrial land, the city still needs to be serviced. The theatre district still need to be serviced. Those hotels still need to be, the retail sector, the food sector. And that probably needs a real strategic review about how we continue to service the city and keep those businesses successful. And I think that a lot of discussions around land, what we're talking about as a business is that supply chain is absolutely vital. And I think it would be great if the committee take on board those comments about how we keep the city thriving. And the role that industrial occupiers play in helping that happen. And perhaps sometimes that connection is not always as fully understood.
That's interesting. Do you think there's a prejudice against industrial premises sometimes at a local level?
Yes.
I think the sector is misunderstood. Maybe the sector hasn't, it's always been brilliant at promoting itself, but I think that not many people work on industrial estates, and they're certainly not aware of what happens behind, the roller shutter door. I'm sure if you went to Mark's factory, you'd be, blown away. But so these aren't always attractive buildings, but what goes on inside is extraordinary at times, and that's the thing that we need, perhaps as an industry, to shout about. And I think just people have misconceptions that it's all about bellowing chimneys and it's dirty, and yet there are some world-class businesses operating in industrial right across the city, and we probably need to do more to celebrate that, but also talk about the role that it plays. So take it almost out of a land context at times and think about the occupiers, talk about the businesses that are keeping this great city thriving, and that's what we don't always do, and we don't always make the connection between what they're doing, which is supporting other industries. We will talk about theatres and the arts, and yet the Barbican, I bet, has a very, very complex supply chain. Well, I know it does, we've done some research, which is serviced by a range of industrial occupiers. It goes on behind the scenes, but it's absolutely vital for the Barbican to be a kind of world-class arts centre. It's that we, and I say that we collectively, need to sort of help people understand and you know, we shouldn't be seeing industrial as a kind of second tier real estate sector. We should be celebrating, you know, the great work that goes on there.
Interesting. Does anyone else want to come in on that, Mark?
Really?
Yes, I do believe there's a lot of prejudice. I think it's not the sort of prejudice that comes out of evil. It's like much prejudice it comes out of ignorance, largely misunderstanding of what the industrial economy is. But I've sat in a meeting, for example, where a borough director of regeneration says we don't want metal bashers here, and I'm sitting thinking, I run a metal bashing business and I'm really upset by that. Why do I have to hear that? And routinely treating with disrespect vehicle repair economy. On the Old Kent Road area where we are, that's the biggest slice of the economy, about 900 jobs in vehicle servicing and garaging and related activities. And yet it doesn't get a mention when they get kicked out thanks to a planning application that gets approved, and they happen to be largely voiceless people who are largely black and minority ethnic. And we're sitting there thinking, this is really not fair, and this is prejudice, and we should gently try to point that out and reveal the validity of those kind of economies to the city, that they're just as relevant as all other sectors of the economy and should be treated well.
I'll just add very, very briefly, I don't know how many industrial operators take part in the open house programme. I'd imagine if there are any, it's very small, but a programme like that could perhaps be extended. I know from my visits to various industrial occupiers across Park Royal over the past few years, how I've been constantly surprised at what behind the facade of a very dull, unexciting shed, you go across the threshold to discover fit-outs that have involved many hundreds of thousands and are providing, sometimes on mezzanine floors perhaps, office space that will compete with much perhaps better regarded locations, because frankly if the occupiers aren't making that level of investment into the office space and the interiors, they won't attract and retain the staff.
Yeah, just to say, I think one of the other areas where there's a perception, perhaps, or a prejudice is around the employment that industry and warehousing. I think there's often a perception that they generate low levels of employment, whereas I think some of the work that the British Property Federation have done looking at logistics and industry is actually that they, when you account for all the operatives coming in and out and shift working, that they actually do provide a good number of jobs, but also provide a diverse range of jobs as well. And I think that's often an area where there is perhaps some poor perception on industrial jobs, and that's another area where I think there's some communication that can be done on that.
What is the percentage? I think I read somewhere about 11-12%.
Yes, so London's jobs are in industrial and warehousing, absolutely, yes.
The research we've done is average salary in London transportation and storage, so it is £38,500, £38,000 per annum. I think just picking up Gerald's point, again, we talk about industrial, we don't talk about the occupier. I've never met anyone who says, when I ask who do you work for, they say an industrial occupier. They say, I work for X or Y. So you may be joining a company that is a global, like a DHL. You could end up anywhere, and certainly in logistics, I would say it's one of the fastest growing careers around at the moment. It's a great career to get into. There are level entry jobs, and again that should be celebrated. A lot of industrial areas are in deprived parts of London, and actually we're working really hard with local authorities to create employment partnerships so that our customers can access local people to support them in their careers. So I think Joe's right, you get a blend of careers, a blend of opportunities, And you know, I think this, you know, the more development that happens, I think the more local communities can benefit from a careers perspective.
Just as a finish off of that, do you think planning officers really understand what industrial buildings are? Because I have experience of whereby they've knocked a few entirely functional, shabby buildings down, only to be replaced by beautiful shopfront units with no storage, no parking, and instructions to keep quiet. Do you think planners need to know more about what an industrial building is?
Yes, and I think that's something very good that the GLA could help with. Because again, it's not that they're all fools. It's probably not that any of them are fools. It's that they're overstretched and their training hasn't covered that. So they default back to what they know as office workers. They know about offices, they know about retail, they know about healthcare, education, they know about all those parts of life because they're part of all our lives. But unless they've tried to find out about it, they won't know what industrial is. They might have never stepped inside any form of industrial premises. So it's a problem. They're just blind because they don't know.
It's the makers, isn't it? The repairers, the mechanics.
Yeah.
I think it is a case of we don't see a planning office come out. I think if there was part of their development to come and visit, you know, not as part of a planning exercise, but talk to occupiers, you can grasp really quickly, not necessarily about the building, but what the requirements of those businesses are. So some of the challenges we have is around car parking. It's not that we want more car parking for more vehicles, it's just there's a changeover in shift, but the policy doesn't. So it would be great if we could get officers to understand the changes in the sector, and we would more than happy to take them out and you know, visit some of our estates and meet some of our customers to do that.
Perhaps to Professor Barilli, do you think stakeholders believe that the current policy is effective in ensuring that there's an adequate supply and the right kind of accommodation? Do you think?
No.
No? Good. That's nice.
I think that current policy has not been at all effective, and it's been talked about somewhat today. There isn't really any ongoing fine-grained monitoring. There is a confusion of objectives, and loss of accommodation is somewhat out of control. No one has any certainty. Rents are rising, purchase is becoming impossible, lease lengths are plummeting across much of the market. The shakier parts of the market can't get a decent lease. So there's quite a significant failure.
We've got James Morgan here from Truman's Brewers. I don't know if is that what you wanted to? If I can ask you, Mr. Morgan, to introduce yourself firstly.
I'm James Morgan. I refounded Truman's in 2010, and we built a new production facility, a new brewery in Hackney Wick in East London in 2013. And a lot has changed since then. There were 2 people, just the 2 of us when we started. There's now 63 of us, and we're forecasting to have well over 150 people within the next 5 years. So we have a huge growth challenge, I suppose is the way to put it. And we're finding that a huge lack of industrial space is our biggest single, it's the biggest single problem that our business faces, or biggest challenge we face. And it's something that I've been working on ever since we built the first brewery, is finding a site for the second brewery. And in the 5 years that I've been working on that, I still haven't got any further. There's no suitable space for us.
So you've looked around London. Is there does this the availability of space vary geographically in your opinion?
We're focusing our search in East London because of our roots and the supply chain that we service. issue, in my opinion, is a question of moving on space. So we've grown rapidly, and I'm sure we'd all agree that we'd like all London businesses that would like to grow rapidly, and we'd like to facilitate that. There seems to be a lack of affordable moving on space. I entirely agree with Mark's comments that lease lengths are dropping and prices are rising, and the ability to buy and acquire land is almost non-existent now. And I think I would, Jules's comments that in an ideal world we wouldn't lose any further industrial land. I think I'll say is, you know, in my real life experience, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, that the property speculators and the property developers and the landowners in many parts of London, and this is not to say that they're all like this, but some of them are like this, are exceptionally good at interpreting the rules in their favour, paying significant fees to lobbyists and other interested parties to ensure that their plans go through. And I could spend hours regaling you with schemes that I've seen go through which have resulted in huge losses of industrial land, and I particularly know about East London. That's where I have spent the last 17 years. So that's one issue we're facing. Another issue I think we're facing is that a large number of potential schemes are somehow stuck in the pipeline. I'm not sure what's called, you know, each scheme, I guess, would have a different reason for not coming forwards at a speed that is suitable for the growth of the London economy. But, you know, so Asia Business Parks in Royal Docks would be a prime example. I don't think anybody can reasonably explain why that's been delayed as long as it has been. The Chelsfield developments down at Millennium Mills, Sir Stuart Lipton, that's been in the pipeline for years. Nothing seems to have happened with it. And again, the list could be endless. But these are huge schemes. The quantum of space that could be released is enormous. And it just simply... So then it feels to me like there must be a substantial disconnect between the London-wide policy and then the interpretation of that at a local level, and then what developers, landowners, and I guess financiers are doing behind the scenes, and at the speed at which they're moving.
I think it's not just industrial land that has suffered from planning regulations being debatable.
No, absolutely. No.
Are you saying that these big developments are probably getting in the way of development? I mean, if you remember King's Cross, in all my adult life, I think that's been underdeveloped and only just got underway.
Yeah.
So, should we be concentrating more on releasing small patches of land or small?
I think it would be well worth the GLA looking at substantial meanwhile uses. So if a large parcel of land is going to lay dormant for literally decades, I think that's a tragic waste when there are small businesses that would be really keen to take it on for 5 to 10 years. And I can name dozens of sites like that. I think it requires a degree of integrity on behalf of what I would describe as property speculators. If they're going to sit on land, they should be upfront about that's what they're going to do. And then, if that's the case, it should be put to them that there are people who could make good use of it whilst they wait for it to appreciate in value.
I'm sure property speculators have a lot of integrity, so that's going to work. So you would argue, therefore, for a more strict application of planning regulations?
Absolutely, yeah, I 100% would. I think it seems to me that there are, there's oceans of grey in the current planning regime, as it were, and that's being exploited to the hilt for relatively short-term financial gain, I think.
So where are you at the moment? You're in process of looking for more land, and you're not finding it, or
no, that's right.
Plan B?
Well, the plan B is that we'll move out of town. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else coming on that point? Yes.
I'll just share my equivalent experience. Part of town where my businesses, where we've been for 70 years off the Orchid Road, all the industrial businesses at several hundred, employing about 5,000 people, face such uncertainties because policy is confusingly evolving alongside negotiations with developers. As a result, we're already losing businesses who don't want to go but have no choice. 200 metres from our factory, a big house builder wants to do 1,000 dwellings on land that's currently strategic industrial land, and that the latest version of possible future policy says can be residential, but there must be industrial incorporated. 26 meetings between the developer and the local planning authority, no meetings with businesses in the area, and it includes nil industrial in the planning application that's just landed. So of course we're very worried. Old Kent Road behind Asda. We're investing in growth in our modest way, spending on our premises and fixed plant. We've just taken on our 10th person and we're now exporting to 40 countries. And we don't know whether we're wasting our money and our energies in our current premises because we don't understand the future. And we have no voice in the process, and we're treated like we're nothing. It feels like a free-for-all mess when you're one of the people caught in it.
Yeah, I think beyond James' point around meanwhile uses is a really good comment. I mean, I think that there are some major regeneration projects, you know, strategic ones. Oak is an example. Meridian Water, and now Meridian Water, they're looking at kind of meanwhile use. Sometimes meanwhile it feels a lot more flexible, you know. But actually, some of those schemes have 5, 10, 15 years. So it does feel to me that there are opportunities, and I think the challenge with the leases, it depends on what the landowner has in mind. You know, so our shortest lease is a year, our longest is 25, and you know, I think that is always the challenge when you're dealing with you know, developers of what their long-term aspirations. I'm sure that Harry will include. They have very flexible lease arrangements to meet the needs of their customer, not because they want to redevelop into high-value uses. But I suppose you don't always know, James, who you're dealing with. Well, you do, but what they're
yeah. I mean, clearly there are different types of landlord and there are different types of lease available. I think the challenge for the manufacturers around in East London, around our area, is that this rapid acceleration in residential development, and clearly I understand the pressures that are placed on housing in London, so I understand the need for it, but whether the balance is right and how that is adjudicated, for want of a better word, I would question. Yeah.
Jenkins.
Yeah, you mentioned the Royal Docks, and I got cover the base there, and part of the Royal Docks Advisory Board. I guess a couple of things are obviously it's an enterprise zone, so I guess that helps the fact that the GLA and Newham ensure that we do maintain this mix of resi and also business. But also the fact, and maybe you could argue it was probably could have happened 3 years ago, but obviously the GLA and Newham have now formed this coordinated team, so it's not a Merrow Development Corporation, but it's now a team dedicated on the opportunity area of the Royal Docks and ensuring that we actually at least realise the full potential of the Royal Docks, and maybe for at least for the 38 or so opportunity areas. I mean, I guess all Kent Road is part of it, but you have these kind of joint, and I don't know whether it's feasible, but you have these joint GLA and the borough teams and the stakeholders engaged. Because we have the various stakeholders, small and large, have a bit of a voice. So maybe that's what you need as well, for Old Kent Road. Certainly, we need a brewery and the Royal Docks. So maybe we should put that on the next top of the agenda, but the next meeting. But I think having this coordinated approach, maybe that'll help, and also giving people a voice.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to put a question now to Deputy Mayor Pipe and Gerard Burgess. What is the Mayor's current thinking in terms of how policy for industrial land and accommodation should be reviewed?
Well, the study was undertaken, which is what the policy going forward is based upon. And as I said, it's a no net loss policy. But that doesn't mean to say that no industrial land will change, because firstly, there's an awful lot in the pipeline that's already permissioned and earmarked in OAPFs and in local plans and so on. But there won't be... But going forward, that we shouldn't be introducing any teeing up any further loss. Also, I said that it's not preserving things in aspic. We would anything that was brought forward, we would want to see as part of a plan-led approach, and again, it would be permissible to see mixed developments, and indeed it would be often desirable, but it can't be at the expense of floor space on in a development. And also, again, the importance of a plan-led approach, that you actually have barriers to between the more sort of challenging industrial use and, say, residential. And if I give you an example, there's if you had a logistics site next to, right where you'd want it, next to 6 lanes of North Circular Road, if it was underused and someone had purchased it with a view to turning it into entirely residential, that would be resisted. If someone said, well, actually we could see double, treble decking logistics tight up to the road where it belongs, and then sort of effectively grading the usage down through associated industrial, office that could be related to businesses, and then on the edge residential where it is abutting existing residential, that kind of graded approach to the use of the land that otherwise might be simply lost solely to residential, or may just remain as not very densely used land, it may well be preferable to, as I say, to optimise the use of that land through that approach. But say it would have to be very much a plan-led approach, because this isn't going to happen by accident. It's not going to happen by ad hoc planning applications.
Because what you described is very close to what we've just had criticised, which is, we come up with a planning designation, and planning policy, and then some way down the line we can argue that industrial land away. I mean, that's just what you've said, is that eventually some of it's going to go.
Well, no, the danger is that what happens is that it goes, and it all goes to housing, and that's where you do see these very sort of huge, dense housing developments slap bang next to some of the worst case stuff, an operational wharf, 24-hour aggregates wharf, 24 hours a day, and that there's been no mitigation built into the design of that housing. So it's got to be very much a design, design informed and design led approach to this. I don't know, Gerard, whether you wanted to come in.
I think also on the issue that Jules raised around, we're wanting to where we can, to drive and incentivise the intensification of industrial locations through examples like multi-storey development, through the use of mezzanines, making more efficient use of the space. But where we have strategic industrial locations, to ensure that we're in any circumstance where we want to intensify that land to deliver no net loss, that we ensure that intensification of the industry happens before the residential component is completed or occupied. So you're ensuring that the intensification is your core sort of driver of making sure you're retaining that industrial warehousing capacity before you release to residential. The risk is if you put it in a plan to say this can go to residential, it will go to residential and you won't get the intensification. So we want to make sure it's done through a plan-led approach to ensure we achieve both objectives for the industry warehousing space, but also to deliver homes for London.
Is the Merrow team talking amongst themselves, you see? Because if you look, for example, it seems that sometimes the policies are contradictory. You've got, for example, in the Meridian Water housing zone in Enfield contains a significant amount of industrial land, and yet it's expected to deliver close to 4,000 homes. You're asking for it, aren't you? You're asking for that industrial land under those circumstances to be changed, the designation to be changed.
I think it's not although there may be strategic industrial locations within a wider housing zone area, it doesn't mean necessarily that all of those strategic locations will automatically go to housing. But what it can do is it shows here is an opportunity to deliver more homes for Londoners, but we also want to ensure that we want to retain this industrial capacity. How can we look at using those strategic locations more efficiently for industry to ensure that we're not losing the function, the floor space and the industrial jobs on those locations, but enable us to possibly release some of that land to deliver on the housing objectives. But before doing that, to ensure we're intensifying the industry, to ensure we're not undermining that as an industrial location.
I mean, in that specific case, it's going to be interesting to see what comes forward.
We have someone who could...
Yes. Yeah.
So we're actually, we are the kind of industrial development partner working with Barratt London on that scheme. And so I think the conversation is around square footage and not acreage. It's around, whether what our aspiration is to deliver, looking at a multi-storey scheme as part of the Meridian Water development to intensify that footprint. So we own and manage the only true multi-storey industrial building in London, which is X2 at Heathrow Airport. So it is two-storey industrial with a ramp up and a ramp down, so you can take HGVs up, and it has yard space, and there's not, that's the only example, because it just hasn't happened in London. There hasn't been the demand. It happens right across. You go to places like Asia and Hong Kong, and Tokyo and Shanghai. There's loads of examples. So we're looking at delivering, looking at opportunities to deliver right across our European portfolio in kind of cities like London, Paris, Munich, Rome. We're looking at building. So in Europe, we're already on site with 3 multi-storey facilities for customers. And we're looking at opportunities here. So what you're able to do through good design, through a master planned approach, is to deliver an intensified amount of industrial land to meet the market needs in a way that when the residential catches up, the two can coexist. And that's a really important issue about how we can get industrial and residential operating together. And that's what we're doing at Meridian Water.
So there you're saying housing's got to wait before the industrial is sorted out.
Well, housing will naturally wait, because in terms of the phasing, it will take a few years to catch up. So we're in the east, and we're in a very harsh environment. The plot we're developing is right up against the A406 North Circuit. You wouldn't put residential, and we've designed a scheme which acts as a fantastic buffer, between the 406 and the residential. So in essence, we can develop that. Subject to contract, we can move that forward in the next kind of six months. We could start, but as long as that's all pre-designed, pre-agreed with Barratt, so when the residential development meets ours, the two are absolutely, as I say, they work hand in glove, and we don't have any friction that perhaps you would probably get between a residential and an industrial scheme.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I didn't say Mr. Dacus.
I wasn't convinced by the Segro comment, because it's not what happens on the highway. Maybe what's happening on your sole site, but reality is the resi people, we're as guilty as politicians. We always talk about homes, homes and homes. Everybody from the mayor down, the government down, we all talk about homes. We've got a homes crisis. We haven't got a jobs crisis at the moment, touch wood, and therefore it's always the resi people that win 9 times out of 10 or 19 times out of 20. And if last time I was speaking to the Meridian people, certainly, they didn't give the same impression what you've just said at all. You know,
In what
they were
sense?
banging on about Resi, as always. These were the council men.
yes.
I'm just interested, you know, you're always the Cinderella. I'm not saying you should be the Cinderella, but you bluntly are the Cinderella.
Well,
And, you know, that's why you've been squeezed out, not just market pricing, but you are the Cinderella. And poor old Jules is trying to work for you, but you know, his other deputy is busy trying to build Resi. The mayor goes on I bet the mayor never asked Jules about this subject, but he asked him probably every week about Resi.
If I might comment, I mean, you know, clearly as a city, we're faced with an unenviable tension, really, between the demands for housing and the needs of sustaining our economy and industrial spaces. You know, if I sit down with members of West London Business and the Park Royal Business Group, you know, probably top of their list alongside transport congestion issues will be housing. And genuine concerns about the affordability of housing in this city and how their younger and more junior staff can afford to live close to work and be effective in their jobs. So clearly we can't solve one problem in isolation. We've got to be engaged on both fronts. And it may be that on some, I suppose, for industrial sites, or sill sites, or probably hopefully not sill sites, but industrial sites, that there is this blended approach that Jules has referred to, where good quality design, planning conditions can enable some level of blending, potentially going multi-storey on some of the land will maintain or indeed enhance the amount of industrial floor space that's provided. But I think there is also a need for us to have clarity as to when we simply say no to residential, and that there is a site that must continue to be 100% industrial. And I highlight just one piece of land that perhaps captures some of these challenges, and I think is sort of, in a sense, a live case at the moment as the OPDC's local plan continues on its journey, and that's the Asda part of Park Royal. Interestingly, that particular part of Park Royal falls outside the SIL designations, so you know, there are some tough choices that have got to be made in settling on the right policy for that area. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to serve up as to what the right policy might be, but I think it's certainly we find interesting in the current draft of the OPDC local plan that there isn't any specific demand that from the redevelopment of that site and that bit of land, that there should be some industrial or new and additional industrial provision within it. There is a proposal for 500 housing units and some retail and commercial space, but not specifically industrial, which seems to perhaps be a missed opportunity as it is within the wider Park Royal envelope.
Thank you. I mean, you heard from me the sort of the theory. I think Andrew, just at the beginning of his comment there, gave a much snappier kind of exposition of it, about sort of this blended approach. And you heard Neil kind of talking about sort of the real life example. And I just wanted to kind of speak to Tony's point, that I think you're right, highlighting perhaps what the contrasting approach is, of which there are two. One is that the housing that's planned in the nearby housing area then abuts sharply with a rather run-down, you know, the Hertford Trading Estate up there, you know, rather run-down, low-density area. So you're not really improving the employment space offer. The residents hard up against that don't like what they're looking out on, possibly complaining, and then it starts, you know, causing problems for the remaining operators there. The other alternative is that, and you highlighted it, was where perhaps there is sympathy in some quarters saying, yes, it's horrible, that bit of industrial land, isn't it? Let's build housing entirely all over that. So I suppose both of those two alternatives are less attractive than perhaps kind of this more nuanced, blended approach where you get the intention is to get more of everything.
Mr. Morgan first.
I don't know the specifics of the Meridian scheme, so I can't comment on that. But what I would raise is that I think there is a natural challenge from anybody involved in manufacturing to the notion that you can have mixed-use development. And I fear that the term mixed-use development is used to bamboozle planning departments, because it looks like you're covering everything, and this is a utopia where you can have loads of residential and you can have a square footage of industrial space, when in actual fact you have a square footage of ill-served industrial space without the eave height that we've mentioned, Harry mentioned before, without the services, without the yard space, and it doesn't work. And I've seen that happen a lot in East London, and I think that's really important to raise, that mixed use is just basically a byword for bad planning, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, Chair, I think I'd absolutely agree with that, and I've agreed with Andrew before about sort of badly designed retail space, when mixed-use developments end up being either one tiny shop front or at best, if it is the best, a small metro supermarket underneath, and apparently that's mixed use. I'm absolutely adamant, and the GIO will be adamant that actually it's a bit like the word affordable housing has become completely rendered meaningless because of what it's been applied to over the years, and equally I think mixed use equally needs to be kind of more tightly defined about what we want to see, and that issue about access, yard space, real head heights for people to do things in, rather than just a tiny bit of retail, rather than actually industrial maker space. You're absolutely right. It's a point well made, and it's one that we're very much cited on.
So, Jules, this old Kent Road scheme that we just heard about, when that comes to the mayor, that's going to get short shrift then. A big housing development with a few little...
From the description of it, yeah.
Sounds terrible. Yes.
And it certainly goes against what we'd like to see on the Old Kent Road. I mean, there's plenty of... I think that, personally speaking, I think there's plenty of opportunity on Old Kent Road from things that are large single-storey retail sheds with car parks, large car parks next to them. That seems to me something that actually should be offering light industrial maker space with offices and housing above, medium rise, 7-8 stories, instead of a 2-storey but inside single-storey shed with a great big car park outside, which without a questionable reason why those kind of retailers would really need that kind of space. And actually going forward with e-commerce, they probably don't and won't. So we ought to be thinking about how we create genuinely mixed neighbourhoods where there is both employment space of all sorts and residential, and move away from what's been happening and is still pushed for, sort of the march of very high density housing down the old Kent Road and sweeping away all of that light industrial. And there's the pressure is still on there for that, and by the sound of it, the ASDA scheme is sounds like an example.
Yes.
So just to Tony's point, Cinderella did marry the prince, so perhaps there's a happy ending to all this. But coming on genuine mixed use, we've already submitted a joint plan application at the former Nestle factory in Hayes, which is a partnership with Barratt London, 1,400 dwellings, 230,000 square foot of industrial space, and I think that includes around about 3 acres of green space open to the public and community space as well, so community centre. And this factory was closed to the public. It had a great brand reputation as Nestle, but it was closed. So we're opening this up. This is what we would call, picking up on genuine kind of mixed use. You can live there, you can work there. You can if there's a gym there, you can go to the gym. You can use the community space. The green space is open. It's not just for the residents. And I think what we're trying to prove there, is that industrial developers and residents can collaborate, and through good design, good master planning, you can bring together these kind of use. It's not going to work for every industrial occupier, but actually through that good planning, through that good master planning, good design, you can eradicate any issues or challenges that the two uses face, and actually to get them to coexist really well. And we're looking at this scheme, and we're thinking that for our industrial occupiers, it'll be a great place to work because of the additional amenity right on their doorstep.
Professor Brewer.
Well, I'm an optimist too, and I believe it is possible to do more, or do forms of development that we've not seen before. And I think that intensification and co-location must be a major part of the way we provide for industry in future. But there are big viability challenges and there are big design challenges. The most important thing to understand about co-location, where you completely mix uses in some clever way, is that it increases the extent of area where the non-residential accommodation must be present. If, for example, you put residential on top of industrial, then you will generally at least halve the yield of industrial space. You can't have as much of it. So, back to, because the residential has to land, it needs more amenity space. It's not just the yard, shared street type spaces that the industrial needs. It needs its cores coming down, it needs bike stores, bin stores. All of that takes footprint.
So you mean the footprint's got to be bigger?
So the footprint of the whole scenario has to be bigger. So if you go back to our little Old Kent Road example, we find ourselves observing that even if you set what we think is a low objective of just maintaining the quantum of industrial accommodation there now is, then, but as part of a more intense and mixed future, then its footprint would need to spread, for example, to include the Aylesbury Estate redevelopment, the Canada Water development, Convoy's Wharf, wherever else that big redevelopment is happening. You would have to be saying, well, we need a bit of industrial in there, a bit of industrial in there, because otherwise you're just not going to fit the accommodation. So that it's not just about doing something more mixed within the existing footprint of industrial. It's about embracing the idea that forms of industrial accommodation, especially at the smaller workshopy end of it, should be incorporated into other mixed developments. They can go underneath office blocks, they can go underneath them with residential if designed right.
That seems to me a good segue into Tom's question.
Yes, I think we went halfway into it.
So, yeah,
You stole your question.
my question is, are proposals for intensification, substitution and co-location likely to be viable approaches? Now, we've obviously been talking a bit just now about co-location. Jules has talked a bit about intensification, building taller warehouses with more floors. Andrew did mention in terms of substitution that lots of companies don't want to relocate outside of London. I wanted to go to Neil and to Harry. You talked a bit about co-location. What about intensification?
Yeah, I was going to. Yeah, so well, first of all, when we had a look at this kind of multi-story idea for industrial estates. We currently own actually various industrial units at first floor level, and we found that the rents are significantly discounted from industrial units on the first floor level, on ground floor, and obviously things like the yard and access become a bit of an issue. Even when you've got a ramp going up to the first floor level, it's the access is not always great. I actually looked at a video of the X2 building on YouTube about how loading is slow and difficult. It's not that easy to get up these ramps. On top of that, we actually own an industrial building near Elephant Castle, which has a shared yard. Well, when I say shared, there is actually a yard with an overhang above it where there's actually residential directly above this yard. And we find that the tenants are blighted with complaints from residents, day in, day out, and it makes it very difficult for them to operate from that unit. Looking into it in a bit more detail, we actually worked out that the minimum site area required to do one of these multi-storied industrial estates was probably about 4 to 5 acres. so it makes it very difficult to actually develop any of our sites in sort of central London. Again, looking at the old Kent Road area, where our sites are, none of our sites are that big. So it just kind of asks the question, how, is there a better way of doing this? How else can we look at doing this? Because I'm not convinced that multi-storey is the way.
So Jules mentioned that they seem to have multi-storey on the continent, and it seems to work there. Why there and not here?
Yeah, I think Neil has something to say because they didn't build X2. You took it on, didn't you?
So,
actually, it's not as well
I'm
designed
going
as
to
they're
probably-
doing their future ones, which will be more on the continental design.
Right. Okay. I'll bring Neil in on
I will be
this.
slightly more upbeat. I think the first thing on X2, yes, we didn't build it, is it's 10 years old. And I think that things have changed dramatically since 10 years ago. The question, if we look at the questions why, because we've never been in this kind of situation where land is so scarce, and actually what is kind of driving. So if you look at why does Hong Kong, I'm sure we all can identify why Hong Kong has multi-storey, because land is in short supply. So there are a number of factors you need for multi-storey. One is you need high demand, a lack of land, high demand, and you probably also need a kind of an anchor tenant as well to make it work. We are far more upbeat in terms of delivering. We've done a lot of work. We've been out to Asia. We've looked at how you can improve X2. We've looked at how it works in Asia and brought all that back. And I think we're confident that we can deliver something. And that is about making it, there are, of course, and Harry's right, that there is going to be an element of compromise, but what you've got to do is build something that is as close to being on the ground level. So if you're on the 4th floor, okay, you'll struggle to punch another loading door through on the outside, but actually it has to be as close as you can in terms of your eaves height, the size of your yard. So they are quite potentially they do take some land because you need a ramp. But we're looking at our smallest multi-storey schemes. We believe we can get to 3 acres.
Okay.
So
how many stories could you go up to?
So on a major one, 4.
4, yeah.
And perhaps on a 3 acre one, probably 3 potentially. The thing I will say is, unlike residential, I'm sure we will definitely agree, the more you go, you don't get more money. Okay, actually the viability, it is a challenge, right. And I suspect that there will need to be at times perhaps support or intervention from the public sector to move these forward.
We're pushed for time, so I just wanted very quickly, because we haven't talked about this one that much, substitution. So moving out of London, how practical is that?
Well, companies can do that anyway, and they choose to stay.
Yeah.
So we own Slough Trading Estate, and I don't think we've ever dealt with a relocation in our 97-year history. They want to be here.
Our customers are here.
From Andrew. Yeah, so picking up on the intensification points, in West London, we've heard the level of demand in Park Royal. It's a red-hot location. If there's anywhere that we could deliver intensified sort of development, it's got to be the UK's largest industrial estate, I'd suggest. But there are significant barriers. I think the transport challenge that I mentioned before has got to be grappled with properly. We've got a workforce of 40,000 trying to move around Park Royal. You have a donut of stations around Park Royal, but you don't have anything that goes directly into the middle. So how do we achieve real modal shift of workers that will often drive onto public transport? Broadband, which I mentioned, has been ducked for too long by key service providers that really need to step up to the plate. But also,
just very quickly on broadband, because this always mystifies me. Is it just that people don't want to pay the price of getting a bit of cable there? Because I don't understand why people don't have broadband.
So in Park Royal, you've got very low-end provisions. So if you want ADSL, you can get it at a very low cost, but that's typically inadequate for a business's needs. you can pay an awful lot of money, maybe £400 or £500 a month for a leased line. But actually the majority of businesses in Park Royal are 10 employees or less, and they want something in the middle ground, and that's what we haven't seen.
It's not that it's
properly
technically
serviced.
impossible to get it there, it's just the price.
So just picking up on the land problem and the size of the footprint of the sites required, the challenge we've got in Park Royal is the level of fragmentation of land ownership. And so I think a sort of an unresolved dilemma, I think perhaps both for the private and the public sector to get their heads around in the months, hopefully not years ahead, given the scale of need, is how do we actually start to put together the sort of the parcels of land into something, or in fact perhaps several locations within Park Royal of sufficient substance to move these multi-storey schemes forward.
Okay, thank you. Should we move on to the presentation now? Thank you.
Yes, I think we should. I think the thing is we wanted to end on a note which looks at, the feasibility, and we're discussing a lot of the challenges and difficulties. But here's someone, John Moore, who will introduce himself properly, but to look at someone who, an architectural practice that is really, making waves in this. So over to you, John.
Thank you. Yes, my name is John Moore. I'm Technical Director at Karakisovich Carson Architects. We have been around for quite a while as a practice. We work mainly with local authorities building affordable housing, and that's led on to developing a speciality in master planning. And we've recently started to work on station design as well, because infrastructure is one of the big obstacles to development sometimes in London, but it's also one of the opportunity areas. I think many of the points I've put here in the first slide have been raised this afternoon, and I think it's probably just worthwhile reiterating that. The images, by the way, are almost all from Meridian Water. On the right-hand side, we've been working with the London Borough of Enfield on the master plan, actually the area action plan for Meridian Water, and there are some examples there of the diversity of ways I think you have to think about the use of land if it's in the transformation state from industrial or semi-derelict industrial into something more of a mixed-use, intensely used piece of city. So the rate of loss of industrial land, yes, it's high. The GLA are minded to halt that. The transformation of industrial land should reflect the changes in employment and industrial land use. So what are the new users? What do they need? So any transformation should try and take that into account. Equally, the presence of transport infrastructure and the expansion of that, for example, Crossrail 2, which is coming along, we need to think about the impact of that on the adjacent land. So, for example, Meridian Water is somewhere round about the middle of this map here, which is the Lee Valley Corridor, and we're working on this, and we've been working on master plans in Hackney Wick, Bromley by Bow, and even doing some work with residents, industrial residents in Camden. And this corridor also pretty much follows the Crossrail 2 expansion, and the Mayor has targeted that to be able to deliver many thousands of homes. So we've got to think about, yes, industrial, but also think about the targets for housing and try and balance them. The definition and measurement of SIL, I think, needs some refinement. Very often this afternoon we talk about hectares. It doesn't really matter if it has one tiny building on it or a 5-storey warehouse, sort of, cheek by jowl with all the boundaries. So I think thinking about square footage is really important, and perhaps coming up with some simple measures. As in the way with housing, we talk about dwellings per hectare and relate that to PTAL. I think a similar thing probably needs to be used for industrial, certainly when you're considering replacing industrial land. So maybe more thinking about replacing industrial footage. And engaging landowners and anticipating the needs of new users is critical. At Meridian Water, there are a number of large landowners there, and sometimes when you look behind that, there are actually big pension funds own some of this land. And I think trying to engage with them at a very long-term strategic level is much more likely to come up with plans that will actually transform the area in a way that suits all parties. So at the very top of the slide there, we see the new station, which will be opening in 2 or 3 years' time. It will grow to 4 tracks and Crossrail 2 by 2032. This area here, the Meridian Water housing zone, as you say, sits within a large, long industrial area. And it actually is at a point where the North Circular crosses the river. It's one of the few areas where west joins the east, and it could potentially be a place of confluence, a real piece of city. So it has real merits in transforming from the current industrial status. As you said earlier, SEGRO are looking at the optimisation of the land to the north here, where a multi-storey logistics centre can actually effectively replace a lot of jobs and a lot of footage in a much more intensely used area, giving a buffer to the noisy North Circular and enabling perhaps some other parts of the site to be used for other uses. Paul Karakusevic is a founder member of Housing Creative London, which is a non-for-profit organisation. We're designing and proposing to build affordable housing for creative people and people in low incomes. And we've identified as one of the first sites this area here, which is currently a gasometer drum in the ground. It's just foundations there. And we're proposing to replace that with a combination of housing at the top, over 4 stories of workspace. I keep moving the slides, apologies. Yeah. This is an example of a mixed use that will be applied to the site. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see one of the sheds. There are a few sheds that are sitting in the centre of the site, and 2 of those sheds are going to be reused for a meanwhile use of 5 to 10 years for the Arts Trust Akava for 250 artists, and also for Building Blocks, which is an open source workshop charity effectively, and they'll be creating 250 spaces for workers. I think thinking about the meanwhile strategy is really important to major wholesale redevelopment. The design challenges we talked partly about today, co-location, so perhaps moving buildings from their current position to help screen more hostile environments, railway lines or motorways, can help keep the uses but reposition them in a way that suits the intensification of our city. The top slides there show an area in Camden near King's Cross where local light industrial users have got together and asked us to come up with some designs for them. They know there's a pressure on their land to be redesigned and redeveloped. And we've looked at a scheme where there's actually going to be retaining their use over phased developments. We can actually increase the space for light industrial and other non-residential uses, as well as introducing much needed housing. I think it's a good example of working with the right people. People actually have stake in it, like Mark was talking about, some of the local light industrial users, engaging with them as well to think about how to develop plans that suit all people. Down at the bottom here is a prototypical study that we did. It started by assessing the Claverings industrial estate in Enfield, which is reasonably well situated for transportation links, and looking at ways of retaining the industrial functions. But Enfield had done some research. Nearly 70% of their industrial buildings are actually not used for industrial purposes. But they are being used by other users who need cheap space or a place where they can make noise or something like that. And I think we should recognise that when we're thinking about the transformation of industrial premises or industrial areas. So the section down at the bottom shows fairly rudimentary, single story with the mezzanine, light industrial type uses. On the left-hand side, more of a small office or warehousey type building that can take these other types of users, a dance school, a language school, something like that. And on the right-hand side, there is housing over workspace as well. So basically thinking about intensifying sites, bringing these users together, and thinking carefully about light and sound and access and so on. As you can see, the visualization to the side there shows there's still an industrial road that takes you into the yard space that allows for logistics and delivery and so on. But the residential can create another frontage onto perhaps the perimeter roads to actually create a place that feels more like a human.
Can I just ask on that? So you're putting you've got residential buildings right above or right to above industrial units.
That's correct.
Well, alluding to what I said earlier, you now on those industrial units have got to say keep the noise down, haven't you? Really, if you
I think, of
so
course.
close.
I mean, one of the reasons for doing this study was to try to explore those issues. I think there's a burden, perhaps, on the residential buildings to insulate themselves from some of the industrial functions in many cases, certainly where mixed-use development is taking place. But also there's things that you can do within the design of the industrial buildings themselves to screen or to control emissions and noise from them. And also I think it's a matter of managing property as well. There are certainly some uses that need to be isolated and work away noisily and perhaps with pollution at an acceptable level, whereas the other uses are maybe more acceptable to exist or coexist with housing. So I think it's a problem that needs to be both managed and have technical solutions for.
Does it also have to be incumbent on the residential developer to ensure that there's noise insulation, dust
Indeed.
protection, whatever, so that the residential development absolutely has to protect its tenants?
Absolutely.
You
And
end up with residential developments without balconies, even though it's multi-storey, because of the noise.
That's a good point.
I think there's certainly a role to play for, although we try and avoid designing single aspect units, if single aspect units face south, for example, or perhaps even relatively small units, they can actually be a very good buffer building joined onto another type of building to effectively create this insulation from a sound point of view, but also avoid any sort of cross-contamination between the uses. I think intensification has to deal with a number of things. It's the footprint, something like, if you compare the square meterage to the hectares of industrial land, only 1/3 of that land is covered, and that's all of the floor space covers 1/3 of the land, so it's clearly not being particularly well used. So we have to think about the intensity of the footprint, consider height, design flexible heights that will allow the multiple number of uses over time, think about employees and productivity, and also buildings that are adaptable. So building slightly higher floor-to-floor heights than maybe you need as a minimum, it will allow the market and the property to flex over time. The tall spaces of the industrial revolution are still being used today for a multiple of different uses. And yes, of course, there's technical issues, and I think we're aware of those, but very often with good design, talking to the landowners and the future users, you can resolve many of these things through building orientation as well as through other technical means. Some recommendations or potential solutions. I think today's meeting is very, very useful. Studies, initiatives, funding policy is important as well. I think the audits that I've heard about are really important. We need to understand what the problem is if we've got any chance of solving it. I think we need to audit and engage and collaborate with key landowners. At Bromley by Bow, for example, the images at the top there were 5 landowners as well as LLDC, who are both planning authority and a landowner. And there was sort of furtive but failed attempts to redevelop parts of this land. They gathered together, and we were engaged as architects for them, and about 2 years ago started to put together a collaborative SPD. So AAPs, SPDs, master plans, all of these things I think need to be done first to think of clever ways of developing industrial or semi-industrial sites. So with a collaborative approach, I think that the site's potential was maximised. It introduced both housing, it retained some of the current uses, and introduced new workspace to reflect the demands that are coming forward in that part of London. And of course we thought about phasing as well, and now there are 2 detailed planning applications in, a 3rd one in the making. So it shows that process of collaboration and using the right planning policies and instruments can be successful. A little image down at the bottom there shows a master plan we worked on for LLDC further upstream at Hackney Wick. And it shows that still modest scale can be retained, judicious retention of the good quality industrial stock as well as introduction of new housing. And it shows you the colour coding shows residential above different types of workspace. That's trying to retain the character of Hackney Wick, but also to intensify its use. Meanwhile strategy, I mentioned it earlier, I think it was mentioned by the panellists. I think it's really important. In Meridian Water, for example, there's the sheds, you can see there's these buildings in the middle. I showed you one example. This is the sort of exploded axonometric of the shed being more intensively used for building blocks workspace. So adding mezzanines and even intensifying one end of that space will enable them to move in and offer space for 250 people simultaneously working on very low rent equipment, metalworking, woodworking, and so on. In fact, Five Stars Brewery are moving into one of the next sheds, or certainly the discussions are ongoing for that. And I think that these sheds at the heart of the scheme actually will start to bring footfall and activity to what's otherwise a pretty derelict area. And I think those meanwhile uses may become long-term or forever uses, who knows. But I think that Enfield have acquired maybe 35 hectares of land, and in the meantime that land needs to be used wisely. It needs to be rented out, or even if it's for open storage, I think the land needs to be used while the master plan is in development. And of course the off-site manufacture, volumetric construction, all of these things can play a part in delivering, particularly in tight sites and difficult sites to access. In this particular case, this cheap shed will have a cheap 5 to 10 year fit out, and that's based on using really off-the-shelf solutions, but nevertheless they are off-site, if you like, to some extent. Other recommendations, volumetric panelised construction. We've done some analysis of the areas around the TfL and Crossrail stations. Single developments around the stations is not going to be particularly successful, but you start to gather landowners together within TfL ownership, come up with a plan that is flexible and you're willing to revisit over time, then much more intensive use of those spaces around stations can occur. And that can, if you think about that over a number of stations across London, it starts to create this master plan of master plans. So I think the plan-led approach that Jules was mentioning, I think is really important. I don't think you were necessarily mean plan policy-led, you mean plan-led approach to intensification. Decking over, stacking of uses, back-to-back uses, all of these things can be used in the right circumstances to intensify the use of current or existing sites. And just leave you a few images from Meridian Water. It's just a visualization of what it might be like in 20 years' time. But 20 years is a long time, and lots of things will have to happen along the way. And I think that something our practice has done over the years is to consult with residents, to consult with local people, to involve as many people as possible that might be involved in the transformation of an area and that may be involved in using it later. And I think that's really key to understanding how to use space well and how to design buildings well. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, John. So, it's with you at the moment, Tom.
I don't really have. I mean, I thought there was quite a lot in there. I don't have any follow-up questions.
Does anyone else want to? We've got just a few moments. Does anyone else want to add anything?
I think just picking up on the discussion between John and Andrew about the use class, and I think that's what we're kind of at times, the occupier and the use class. I mean, if you look, there are businesses that make noise, but there are businesses that are very quiet. We have a lot of customers that are in the media sector, so we have studio space, we have customers that are providing lighting equipment, audio-visual equipment to the film sector. They're not bashing metal, they're not making noise. And I think one of the things that...
Can you just speak up a bit? Sorry.
Yeah, so one of the things we need to think about is again, the occupiers. Because I think at the moment we just think of what use class they feel in, rather than, are there sectors that actually do, you can put quite closely next to residential areas as well. As I say, we've got a number of customers, so we have Pagani and Ferrari, that operate out of an industrial unit. They could operate quite easily, next to a residential area. They're not causing any kind of noise, and the same with media sector. So I think
that's highly theoretical, because once the local borough's noise team get onto it, they couldn't care less about what the planning application was about. Well, if you built a residential development next to a very noisy industry, the borough's noise team will enforce against the industry. It is irrelevant what the planning application said.
Well, we've had this in Park Royal at Origin. We've had London and Regional build a residential tower next to the former Gibbs Brewery site, and that kind of exists. What I'm trying to talk about is that there should be further research. We believe we have occupiers. I think what you might find from an industrial developer like ourselves, and maybe Harry, that we would be calling for 24 hours, 7 days a week use. you know, and but there are industrial occupiers or sectors that don't make a huge amount of noise. That's what we have studio space, you know, so actually you can't hear anything, they're soundproofed. So, you know, that we believe that actually some of the use classes, you know, we won't need to review those as whether which sectors, which our customers, that's what we're being.
Well, it's not just noise, it's smelling of hops, is he still here, that kind of thing. You know, which can be quite uncomfortable for residents. I think it's all. What I need an answer to is this. I've heard this theory before about how you can mix different uses together, and it's so rare. It's just so often.
This is the necessary
I'm
application.
telling you that it is being done.
We put a planning application. Well, okay, you know, that's.
Take me there. Show me.
Yes,
Well,
I
we
think
get
that's.
consent and we build it. Yeah.
I think we'll have to do that.
We will do that.
We did, by the way, Jules, you may remember, last November, at the City for Londoners discussion, we suggested an agent of change for buildings which are residential buildings that go right up against some of these industrial sites. And I think, you know, are you going to accept that principle? I noticed the Park Royal is going to accept it, which is good.
Yes, I think we've already spoken about it in public. Obviously, that's more relevant to where you have a pre-existing use, whether it's the housing use and the agent of change is the who comes along is something that's noisy or obtrusive in some way, or the other way round, where you have a business use and someone comes along and wants to put housing along their side and suddenly demands that the business use has to change its operation or incur costs as a result of, you know, so they don't cause any inconvenience to the new residents. Absolutely, an agent of change principle should dictate that the ones that came along second should take the responsibility,
But we haven't
or
got-
must.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that will be in the plan.
Just look at. I recommend you looking at the tears there were over trying to build a tower block next to the Ministry of Sound. You know, it was. But basically, I mean, it's not this subject. I understand, but the Ministry of Sound, all their business is their license, and a licensee could go along and take it away on the basis of somebody new person coming into the tower block who complained that he didn't like the sound of heavy metal or whatever it is.
We're going to have to make it future-proof it.
Yeah, sorry.
Come in. We're going to have to do it very quick.
Just to say very briefly, picking up on this point of noise, and I suppose the diversity of noise levels in an estate like Park Royal, there's the opportunity perhaps to try and cluster the noisiest industries in Park Royal somewhere central, away from the fringes where you may have residential encroachment, to remove some of those conflicts.
Right. Yeah, a couple of others want to come in. No?
One.
Mark?
I guess the future factory, and I guess we need to look long term. The future factory is going to be digital. It's going to be quiet. It's going to be different. So I guess we need to plan for the future. But I guess we.
It's not. There's still going to be people fixing cars and making.
Yeah, but if you go to Steadall Bridges around the corner, it's quiet, and there's people being apart from people chatting, creating, and making. It's quiet. So I think, you know, it's obviously it's a mix, but I think, you know, we need to think about the future. I've lived in Germany next to factories, and obviously the houses are insulated, but it's all regulated, it's all planned in a way, so it can be done.
Members, I feel a site visit coming on. Did you want to say something, Mark?
Yes. Well, I think it's right to highlight these challenges, and they're very real design challenges that are of a type that cities face when they grow fast. They have to invent, and I think that's a collective challenge, and I do think that the Mayor and the GLA could have a significant role in helping figure out the answers. Just going back briefly to the Old Kent Road,
Good note to end
our
on,
little bit. That by far the noisiest industrial style thing we've got is a big Asda. It has the biggest trucks, causing the biggest problems on the street, and it has the noisiest chiller plants that are also a bit smelly when you walk past them. And yet, these days in London, we see it as a routine job to build such a big footprint supermarket with residential on top. Those very challenging issues get resolved, and we ought to be able to resolve in the same way for majority of industrial uses. But you're absolutely right, we haven't done it yet.
Right. Well, on that note, please, I have to end this meeting, but I just want to say we're going to use what we've heard to inform some recommendations and some, obviously, further discussion with Jules and Gerard. I hope you all agree that we've covered a lot of ground, but it's been extremely fecund in a way. I think very useful insights coming forward. And thank you all very much, all our panellists. Thank you, Jules and Gerard, and thank you to our members.
Chair,
I can't close the meeting.
I'm just going to ask the committee to very quickly note the report and discussion and delegate authority to you.
Noted.
Noted.
Oh,
Delegated.
Okay.
Agreed.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Let's go, yay!
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound. GLA, Committee Room